Welcome to Remarkable Retail Podcast, Season 9, Episode 3. I'm Michael LeBlanc.
And I'm Steve Dennis.
We have another leading global thought leader and retail industry analyst on the pod as we try to all make sense of the wonderful, fast-moving world of retail. Simeon Siegel, Managing Director, Senior Analyst at BMO Capital Markets, excellent human being, is back on the podcast, and we couldn't be more excited.
I imagine many of our listeners have probably seen Simeon's smiling face, as well as heard his keen insights on places like CNBC. But also, I believe this is kind of like his annual return to the podcast, because I believe I went back and looked, and he's been on 3 other times, roughly a year apart. So like what is that, the Swallows to Capistrano? Or something? I don't know. Anyway, but yes, always a great friend of the pod, great friend of ours, and always brings the knowledge, even when he's not 100% right. But anyway, we'll get into that.
We'll get into that. And in just a few sleeps, we'll be together again at in Dallas at the RevTech Summit, recording some episodes in the Scratch Events DJs remote podcast studio. A little bit about Scratch Event DJs. They curate talent from their proprietary network of top local DJs to deliver in-store experiences that keep people coming back for more for any event, anytime, anywhere. So there you go. Now, before we get to our great interview with Simeon from BMO, let's dive into this week's most important retail news, brought to you by Scale, the world's fastest growing enterprise commerce platform. Learn more about their solutions at scale.com. That's SCAYLE.com. All right, so we're going to start with some meaningful economic news. Like what do we say? A wee bit of macro news and what it may portend. Interest rates, finally, long predicted or long anticipated. Tell me what you think and what you made of the announcement yesterday.
Well, at least for the U.S., this has been long anticipated. So I don't know that it's actually news. But maybe the news was that the Fed went 50 basis points rather than 25. Mm-hmm. If folks have been following this at all, they'll know there's been a little bit of this debate as to whether this signals that the Federal Reserve is worried about the economy, so they went deeper than some people expected, or whether they're just kind of playing catch up, because I do think there's some sense that perhaps they should have started a little bit earlier. But in any event, now we're in this declining interest rate cycle. And as we've talked about, I guess last week, it's a little bit up in the air as to how quickly interest rates will move. Just looking outside the U.S. quickly, the Bank of England has held steady just, this past week. And there's a little bit more worry about inflation in the UK, particularly on the services side. I think from a product standpoint, they're kind of in the low 2s, which is pretty much where the US has been trending. And the ECB, which has already made some moves and been kind of holding, Christine Lagarde mentioned that there might be an accelerating pace of cuts. So we'll see how that plays out. But I think the overall picture, at least for many economies and where most of our listeners are, is that we're now moving into a more declining interest rate environment consistently, as opposed to just a little bit scattershot. Can you remind me the Canadian situation has been what?
Well, it's interesting because we were thinking on it. I was reflecting on it with someone yesterday. The experience here in Canada, we had 10 consecutive interest rate increases, and then they paused for about almost a year, and then they started decreasing, the Bank of Canada, but only at 0.25 or 25 basis points. So they did 3 consecutive 25 basis point reductions, and it didn't create anything. It didn't stimulate anything. It's like almost too small to take notice, like they're hoping for the cumulative effect. So some of us were thinking that the U.S. kind of looked north and said, well, if we're going to get any attention in the market and really get consumers' attention that something's important going on, maybe we got to make a bigger statement. And that's some of the dialogue here. Because I talked to retailers last week, and they're like, nobody noticed. Like, the spending patterns haven't changed. Maybe we needed a bigger, more splashier announcement. Yeah. So that's the context here.
Well, I guess what I would say quickly on that, because I know we touched a little bit on this last week, is that it's not as if the world radically changes just because of relatively minor interest rate cuts. I mean, first of all, from a mortgage rate standpoint, a lot of the interest rates are already reflected. It's not like everything moves in lockstep. Historically, for example, credit card rates and consumer loan rates generally tend to be pretty sticky. So maybe we'll see some more aggressive, interest-free promotions or something as interest rates come down. But I don't think it's going to be. I mean, it's positive for stimulus over the longer term, but I don't expect kind of this sudden shift of consumer spending. In fact,
I don't know.
In a moment, I think we'll get to that. A little bit more data on that, and then we also got the monthly retail sales report. This is the NRF CNBC, the newer one. We think is a little bit more accurate, and not a ton of news here. A little bit more of the same, other than a bit of moderation. So core retail sales were up just about 2% year over year. Just digging below the numbers a little bit. Clothing had an actually really strong month, and I don't know, other than we've already talked about a few like Abercrombie and Fitch that are just doing really well, but it's hard to believe their sales alone are the big driver of this number. So that's kind of interesting and a little bit of a trend change. General merchandise, so Walmart, Target, Costco, these sort of guys, up just under 2%. And, that's a pretty good barometer for the overall economy. So coming in kind of in line with total retail sales. So that's not a super robust number, but still positive. And then again, more of the same kind of with big ticket. And this will be clearly the place as we look in the months ahead where we would expect to see some change because these are more interest rate sensitive. But consumer electronics, major appliances, furniture, all down again, though slightly. Sporting goods was an interesting one. Now, this is actually a category that's really not just sporting goods. It includes books and hobby stores and things like that. So it's a little hard to parse. But overall, it was down 10%, which is a pretty big number in general, but also a pretty big break from the trend. And again, it's hard to look at one retailer's success and say how that affects the number, but we know Dick's Sporting Goods was up pretty strongly. So I don't know if they're just stealing a lot of share, but again, it's not just really a sporting goods number. So I'm not quite ready to make too much of that. I think it'll just be more interesting when we see the quarterly reports from individual retailers. And the last thing quickly, kind of more the same trend where online has been running in kind of the high single digits. So this is lower than the historical growth rates of e-commerce. But, as we compare to the high rate of e-commerce spending kind of post-COVID, we're still kind of just settling into this more moderation where online continues to grow 3-4 times as fast as brick and mortar, but not at the kind of robust rates we were seeing pre-pandemic.
Let's stick with the NRF for a little minute. I was thinking of you this week when NRF made their announcement about a new European conference because you were at an event in Singapore last year. Did you see that they're going to have a big conference in Paris next September?
I guess they are either responding to Shop Talk, having expanded several years ago to Europe, as well as just the World Retail Congress has been, mostly situated, their conference in Europe, and or the success, which I think objectively there was good success for the first NRF APAC show. So interesting. Yeah, they're going big and broad. So I'm sure we'll be getting more details on that. But yeah, Paris next September. So put that in your diary. Maybe we'll see you there.
News from Amazon. Interesting news about a request or demand, I guess, from Andy Jassy for the employees to go back to the office.
There's two reasons actually I wanted to include this story. One is that, and the story is the return to office 5 days a week, basically, or, hasta la vista, baby. And this is getting a lot of pushback from Amazon employees, apparently. I also posted on Twitter, because I refuse to say X, an Amazon employee who, I wouldn't say it's a conspiracy theory, but he tries to paint a bigger picture as to what this is about, which is largely about getting costs down and kind of forcing people out without having to fire them, basically.
Oh, that's interesting.
As well as there's some tax considerations because of some of the deals. So if Amazon can get more people working in physical offices, then they will be able to accrue more tax incentives. So it's interesting. I hadn't thought about it that way exactly. But So anyway, that's kind of the Amazon specific news. The other thing is and I would be curious if you've seen any other data on this. I mean, between Amazon and some other companies, it does seem like we are seeing a stronger move back to office than I think most of us, myself included, would have expected, say, from a year ago. And that's interesting if it tends to, or that is playing out, or that trend continues, because as we've talked about a bunch of times, that affects shopping patterns, right? So more people back to the city core, that creates more retail opportunities there, as well as one of my predictions is this kind of the slow moving crisis in commercial real estate because of the very high vacancy rates in a lot of offices. Well, not that we're going to go back to 100% 5 days a week with every company. I think that's clearly not going to happen, but it puts a little less pressure on some of the landlords if they start to see materially higher vacancy rates in some places. Any thoughts on that from your perspective?
I mean, I'm not by nature a conspiracy fella, but there's a lot of forces that say get people back to work because we need them spending money around where they work, right? From business improvement people to municipalities who need tax dollars to associations representing retailers who say we need them back at office drinking coffee and having bagels again because the downtowns are dying. So it does feel, initially it's felt to me like pushing water up a hill with a rake, but more and more are coming on board. I mean, the government of Canada mandated 3 days for their office and for all their employees, and they're pretty clear about it. They want people spending money when they're there. Under the guise of it's more productive. But if it's more productive, and I had this conversation with somebody, one of the big banks, well, then you wouldn't have outsourced all your call centers to India then, would you? Because you didn't seem to be too worried about it then. So, I think there's a lot going on beneath the surface here I don't know if it's, I don't really have a dog in this hunt, so to speak. I work from home. So, I'm kind of a neutral actor, just an observer. And in one way, it's good for retail. In other words, it's just a continuing pattern. And I think there's a lot going on underneath the surface. Let's turn our mind to the holiday season. It's Black Friday's a little later this year in the pattern of where it moves around Thanksgiving. So that does create a bit of a shorter season, perhaps. What are you hearing about the forecast for holiday?
Well, first on this shortened season, I mean, that is, I guess, technically true. I've actually studied this on several occasions as well as looked at some other analysis. And I think the overall conclusion is it doesn't make a bit of difference whether the season is shorter or not. So I don't know if that's still true because it's been a little while since I've looked at that in any real depth. But anyway, yes, you'll hear about this shortened season. So anyway, I think people generally spend the same amount for the holidays, and it just means they spend a little more on the average day. So anyway, but one thing just to talk about one particular retailer is that, and I know it seems like for the 4 years we've been doing this podcast, we've always talked about the holiday season kicking off earlier. And I guess we're leaning into that by talking about it in September. We're still quite a ways away. But
we're part of that trend. We're right on trend.
We're part of the problem. But Target has announced that they're going to be kicking off their holiday spending season and marketing October 6th. And they're going to be doing a campaign that leans into their Target heritage. I'm sure many people will know that Target is often, not so much anymore because they haven't really marketed this way, but apparently they're going to do a little bit of nostalgia, which, sometimes nostalgia stuff can be a little bit sad, but sometimes it's, brings this warm feeling to people, and it's a little bit different. So I'm sure they've spent a fair amount of time on the customer insight that led to that. So look for that in a couple of weeks. But we're also starting to get holiday forecasts. I imagine we'll have a couple of more perhaps to talk about in the next few weeks. But first of all, just for a point of reference, in the U.S., sales were up during the holiday season, which is generally October through January. Some firms do a little different calendar. But they were up 4.3% last year, so that's a bit higher than the historical average. Well, Deloitte is out there forecasting they always do a range. Come on, Deloitte, put a stake in the ground. But we have many friends at Deloitte, so if you're listening, we're sorry. We're just having a little bit of fun.
Put a stake in that Jell-O. Come on.
Exactly.
Come on.
Yeah, stake in the Jell-O is always a good idea. So, and that's STAKE, just to be clear. Deloitte, their prediction is 2.3 to 3.3% increase. Salesforce is predicting only a 2% increase. So that would be a pretty significant moderation. Now, their methodology is, I think, a little bit more, is a little bit different. So I'm not quite sure.
These are all net of inflation. I mean, I had the same observation when you were just chatting about your overall results. I mean, inflation's hovering, still is with us. It's kind of moderate, but it kind of means flat to down.
Correct. Yes. Right. Yes. I think, you get into a little bit of the mix issue, but yes, I would say yes. If you assume inflation is 2 to 2.5, that would suggest that the real rate of growth in the sales force would be down, and then just barely up, I guess, in the Deloitte. Last one here, just quickly, is Bain. They're predicting 3% increase. So I think the overall picture. Oh, and what I should mention with Bain is the other thing they said, which is interesting, and it feels, I don't know that I totally buy it, but they say that 90% of the incremental growth will come from online. That sounds a little high. And we talked about, I guess, last week that if you look at the first 6 months of the year, that 50% of all retail growth came from online. So this would be much, much higher. So we'll see. If I just, without any real data, my machine would probably crank out like 60 to 70. But anyway, we shall see. But that's an aggressive prediction. So yeah, now we start to shift our attention to the holiday season.
Well, a little color commentary. I write a report here in Canada, talk to a bunch of retailers, and they were all saying their observations were that the summer sales were not driven by sales promotion. In other words, when they did sales promotions, did deals, did sales, it didn't really drive incremental traffic or incremental sales. So they're reflecting upon that when they're thinking about in the last days of planning around Black Friday, Cyber Monday. Basically, they're thinking we're going to be there, we're going to compete, it's going to be great. But it's not going to turn the season around, won't change the momentum. So maybe we don't have to go as deep, and because it won't work. People just, they're just, they don't have the money and they don't have the focus. So anyway, we'll see if that all, how and where and how that all plays out.
Well, I'll just say quickly on that. I've heard, not for exactly those reasons, I've heard retailers say that a lot. And then when they fall behind their sales plan, Katie bar the door.
Yeah, we used to say one of my last gigs, it's never too early to panic. So there you go. All right. Well, let's leave the news there. Once again, our news is brought to you by Scale, world's fastest growing enterprise commerce platform. Learn more about them and their solutions at scale.com. But let's get into our interview with the amazing, the wonderful, the insightful Simeon Siegel.
Well, Simeon Siegel, welcome back to the pod. We actually have our tailors busily working away, crafting your 5-timer jacket, should you come back on the pod again, because I believe this is your 4th time. Welcome back.
I am very excited. I was wondering what color we were going to get, so I'm sitting here in incredible excitement.
I've heard personalization is very important, so obviously there will be a lot of choices. But anyway, stay tuned. You haven't made it to 5 yet. But anyway,
my kids are teaching me growth mindset, so it's all about the yet.
Ooh, interesting. I have to look into that. All right, enough of this silliness, because we are busy, important people. At least you are, and we want to talk to you about a bunch of things. But for the 4 or 5 people in the world who may not know who the heck you are, would you mind telling those folks a little bit about your personal and professional journey and the work you do?
I'm glad this is audio and not visual, as you see my face turn bright red. So I'm always lovely joining you guys. And I am Simeon Siegel. I work for the Bank of Montreal. I'm very lucky and privileged to have a seat where I get to opine and analyze and probably a bunch of other descriptors about the wonderfully changing consumer landscape and the retail world. And that brings me to talk to you guys. My job is to advise investors on the health or lack thereof of these businesses. But I also get the fun part of being almost on my 5th recurring visit.
Well, we're trying to create a little sense of drama, but it's been almost an annual thing at this point. So anyway, well, there are tons of things we could talk to you about. One of the things I thought would be interesting, just kind of very big picture to talk about is, I've been talking about this retail's great bifurcation, kind of the separation between the winners and losers. Originally I talked about that really in the context of just certain kinds of formats, the value side of the equation doing well, luxury tending to do well, and then the collapse of the middle. But it does seem like, broadly speaking, the gap between winners and losers, whether we're talking about particular retailers, categories, A malls versus non-A malls, et cetera, seems to be growing. Do you see it that way? And what do you think are some of the drivers here?
Oh, gosh, I think you are so dead on. Listen, this has been your theme forever. And again, whether it's specific segments or not, deviate, like just the notion of, I think originally, and I think you right now maybe didn't give yourself enough credit. I think it was not, which is, I just think it is not that there's just high versus low income or luxury versus not. I think the important part that you've always been on top of is that, no, there's winners and losers in every segment. And that's great. Because then it's not just a macro factor. It's not just, are we in a good environment, bad environment, high income, low income, mall, off mall, luxury, not. I mean, you and I were talking about this earlier. This quarter, so a couple weeks ago to a month ago, I don't remember exactly when it was, LVMH and Kering and Burberry told the world, you know what, luxury's not working either. Everyone forgot that a week later, Prada and Hermes told you, no, we're doing pretty okay.
Not so fast.
And so the same thing happens across everything. Like I'm sure we'll talk about Nike given the timeliness of what just happened. But if you think about Nike and Adidas telling you that, you know what, it's kind of tough in athletic and apparel right now in that footwear market that was the one pushing us forward. Although you forget that Hoka and Deckers are telling you, nah, it's still kind of working. Or Hoka and On, it's still kind of working. And so what's fascinating is everything, whether it's Gildan versus Hanes, whether it's Victoria's Secret versus Aerie, whether it's Michael Kors versus Coach, like businesses selling the same thing to the same people are seeing completely different results. And that's not the message that we're getting from the mainstream, but it's really, really great if you're a good operator. Right. And it's really, really bad if you were just riding coattails of a good environment.
So how do you separate out? I mean, clearly macro factors are important. How do you generally separate out the kind of characteristics or whatever the dynamics are in a market, whether income is growing or inflation or, those kinds of factors. And now, we've got an interest rate. Looks like we're going to be in a lower interest rate environment coming up. So that would seem to favor big ticket goods, those kinds of things. How do you separate out those macro factors? And what do you look for in a particular company, whether it's a company you follow in particular, or just sort of more broadly within the retail landscape?
So I guess that's the art versus the science, but there's absolute science because you're right. I should not ignore it. In the beginning of COVID, after the first few months when we were all concerned, after that became the absolute best time to be a retailer. It didn't matter what you sold. There was a complete lack of inventory because of supply chain and a complete glut of capital because of stimulus. And so everyone had a lot of money to spend and not a lot to spend on, which meant everything that was on the shelf, good or bad, sold. And it sold not just at full price, it sold at a dramatically higher price. And so And the same thing in reverse happened the next year, where all of a sudden supply chains opened, and so there was a flood of inventory, and stimulus went away, and so there was a lack of capital, and so it was a tough environment. But you need to take those things into account. Right now, we have interest rates to take into account, but if you're a good business, you're supposed to be able to do well and outperform in a bad environment as well. If you can't, if you're just riding what is happening in the outside world, it doesn't speak to your skill as an operator or a leader or really in anything in terms of execution. And so right now, what I have to do, my job is to incorporate all the externalities, plug them in, figure out what the average company should be doing in that environment, because I think it's fair to say that the average company should be very much impacted by the external factors, and then put the plus or minus, and then say, okay, these companies are outperformers, and therefore whatever the average should be, if the average revenue growth should be 3, then perhaps they should have 8. If the average growth should be 1, then perhaps they should have 4. Whatever that is, and again, I'm just throwing things out, but I think that's what's really important, and we should spend some time on the interest rate, because I think it's important to understand what exactly interest rates do. I think the fact that inflation was so long ago and we went through, everyone finally understands what inflation means, but I don't think people fully get what happens when you cut the rates. I think there's this view that it's this panacea and all of a sudden everyone has more money. But I think what we need to remember is that lower rates impact people and companies who save dramatically different than people and companies who spend. It's supposed to help those who spend and borrow because the cost to spend and borrow goes down. But I don't know about you, the yield, the return that I'm making on my cash in my bank account is going to go. It has already been going lower.
Right.
And so that was free money that starts going away. Companies are no different. A lot of these companies have actually been earning a ton of underappreciated cash on their bank accounts.
And, I think that's a really important distinction. I guess the other thing, and Michael and I have touched on this a little bit in the last couple of episodes, is how quickly, for the businesses that are more interest rate sensitive, both, I guess, in terms of those that are borrowing money or just they have consumers that might be particularly interest rate sensitive. What's your experience on how quickly that tends to work through the system? Because part of what I think is, 50 basis points when you have had high interest rates sounds like a lot, but in the scheme of things, it's really not necessarily all that significant. And if people think interest rates are going to come down further over the next, say, year, they may just wait to get a better deal to refinance their mortgage or buy that car or whatever it might be.
So keeping in line with the idea of things my kids are teaching us, we've already done growth mindset. The second thing is it's not fair. Life's not fair. It's not fair, right? Because
slow down. I'm taking notes. This is good.
Working on my parenting books over here. I just use you guys as my material to source. We'll see what works. So it's not fair. What do I mean by that? If you go out and take a mortgage tomorrow, those rates did not plummet. But check your bank account, what you're being paid probably did. So in the spirit of the house tends to win, it will take longer for the benefit than it will to feel that loss. Now, again, ultimately, they all should happen. And the question, to your point, is time. And so there's different types of borrowing. There's what's called variable spend, there's variable rate, and there's fixed rate. Someone can have a 30-year mortgage where the interest rate does not change. Someone can have a variable mortgage where the rate will change. Think about it from a credit card perspective, that can move a lot faster. And so the question here is, how fast does your rate, again, to oversimplify, how fast does your rate change? If your rate changes quickly, then there's obviously going to be a smaller gap in between when you start feeling that benefit or pressure from your bank. But that doesn't mean that all of a sudden we're going to blink. Even if 50 bips, to your point, taking it down by 50 basis points, taking it down by half a percentage point, is all things considered still well above where we were. So, but even if it was a materially larger, it still will take time. You don't blink and all of a sudden you're borrowing at that dramatically lower rate.
Right. So before I kick it over to Michael, maybe one other kind of big picture issue I'd love to get your thoughts on. There seems to be, and I don't know if your data lines up with this, there seems to be an increasing concentration of spending. So in particular, Walmart, Amazon, Costco, a few others representing a very large percentage of the incremental growth in retail overall. But I think we've also seen some data that suggests that if you look at the incremental growth, about 50% of it is coming from e-commerce in particular. Well, first of all, does that just generally line up with what you see? And what do you make of that if you're a retailer trying to compete with those guys to try to find opportunities to grow above the average rate of retail?
So I think it's really interesting. I think you and I have this general conversation in various capacities and for various topics a lot about the fact that sometimes reported numbers are wrong or are fraudulent, but numbers, as much as the fact that they don't lie, can still be tweaked and manipulated to tell stories. And so percentages are very important. We say it's growing 50%. The question is off of what, and what are we lumping in there? And so recognizing that a lot of the businesses you just mentioned have a lot of staples and a lot of grocery and a lot of other elements in there, I think is one thing we need to account for that's there. I think what I would say is, and this is, I think, so interesting because on the one hand, the easy story to take from what you just described is the big get bigger, is that you have a moat, you have convenience, and you just cannot be competed against. And so that's the easiest takeaway from what you have. The problem is, if we rewind to the very first thing we talked about, and I said to you, which companies from a brand perspective, because you were talking, we just are alluding to the box, right? In big quotes, whether it's a physical box or an online box. We're talking about the retailer, the one who sells it. But if we go back to the brands that I mentioned before, who did we acknowledge was growth versus shrinking this past quarter? Well, LV, Kering down, Prada, Hermes up, Adi, Nike down, Hoka on up. The big, and again, this is just, we can decide, are we parsing things out? But in those instances, the big are actually donating to the small. And so it's this interesting discrepancy that I think we're seeing so far, still well away from calling it a real trend, but it's something my team and I are looking at. But so far, the larger ones are giving way to smaller, which is whatever, that whole innovator's dilemma. It's just sometimes you get too large, you lose what makes you special, you sit on your laurels, and it gives an opportunity for others to jump in. That's very different than companies aren't buying. That's very different than saying, oh, how do I compete with one of these incredibly large boxes? Because I'm pretty sure Hoka and On and Prada and Hermes are probably not selling through the channels that you and I are talking about as being the core winners. And so I think that it's a little bit case specific. It's a little bit segment specific. But what we learned from those brands is that even in a tough environment, if you can give a compelling product, story, brand messaging, speak to your consumer, which again sounds so basic, then you're going to win. And it's funny, I was reading in the spirit of social media, someone posted a New York Times quote that I had this past week about the Nike leadership and talking about how the magic of Nike was their storytelling, and they had walked away from that. That was the oversimplified quote. And so someone had grabbed that, posted it, and I was reading one of the comments, and one of the comments is, if it takes a retail analyst to say that, we have a problem. And so I was laughing, but it was right. It's like some of this stuff sounds so simplistic, and yet we sometimes move away from it.
So interesting. Let's shift gears a little bit not away from the same brand names, but into how they go to market. Last couple of times we've had you on the pod. In fact, we've shared a stage together in New York at the Lead, talking about DTC versus the wholesale debate. What's the right way to go to market? And, you and your team wrote a seminal report on, it's not all sunshine and roses when you're DTC. There's a lot of costs that people don't take into account. Now, we've seen some winners, some losers, and we wanted to get your opinion on, I guess, an update of your thinking around this, how to go to market. Is there and can there still be a successful direct-to-consumer strategy, or is the jury out? You are going to have to move in all channels, and that is your path to victory. What's your latest thinking on that?
So this one's fun. And yes, we have had many a fun virtual and IRL conversation over this. And I would say two things. One, we actually finally, it took a while, but we published an update to that report. So that report came out, honestly, probably almost 3 years ago to the day today.
Right.
We just finally published an update, and the update pulled a string that we left in there. I don't really know what an Easter egg is, but I'll say it was an Easter egg. But pulled the string that we left in the first one that basically said, the exception to the idea that D2C is not this amazing lift to revenues and margin and profits, the exception to that, high margin businesses. Companies that start out with an incredibly high profit margin, product margin, gross margin, unit margin, pick your word, but the idea is not your operating expenses. You literally make a lot of money on the units you sell. Those businesses, and that rate is a very high bar, but those businesses would actually benefit by going direct, because they're not going to save enough operating expenses to offset what they're going to share by giving you the margin. That was what we found in version 2, and it was very interesting, and I think that that's an important point. That explains why a lot of these luxury businesses, because again, the easiest pushback for me would always be, well, how does LVMH seems to do it pretty well, right? We're picking on them in the first half. Let's give them credit for the second. So that was what we found, and that was very interesting, and I think that that is a very important distinction. But other than that, if your margins it's just math, this notion, this fear, this belief, if I totally oversimplify it for myself, all of those pages of deep dives, what we said, what we realized, companies thought forever that going direct, you eliminate the middle person, make more money. You don't eliminate the middle person. You become the middle person. And guess what? That middle person actually does their job. They don't always make that much money. There's a reason people knock on department stores. There's a reason people knock on third-party retailers. Their gross margins aren't that high. Let them do their job and you'll benefit. And so that, I think, is the main point where I just continue to stress D2C is not all it's cracked up to be. It's not an anti-D2C pitch. It's an anti-wholesale pitch. And we're obviously seeing that with Nike and the conversation to turn around. I think it's an important point. I think it sounds still, people are finally getting a little bit more comfortable with it, but I still need to hammer that home. I still need to show the numbers, because every now and then we keep saying, okay, but my direct is going to be better.
Right. Interesting. Now, let's stay in the same kind of vein of discussion, but go, I guess, the opposite of an LVMH. I don't get tired of saying this. The party is over, apparently, for Tupperware. Now, Tupperware's, they're as OG as you're going to get. I mean, they've been doing house parties and selling in their way direct, whether that's multi-level marketing for years. And of course, they declared bankruptcy. Is there anything to be learned from Tupperware? Did they just watch the last couple of decades go by and didn't adjust? Or are there lessons? And who knows? Maybe there's a comeback story there to be had.
Well, you know what's fascinating? Think about how many different, insulated thermos-like cups you have right now. I have too many. Multicolors, they look great. There's great marketing stories, whether you jump from Yeti to Stanley or like everyone has them. They make a lot of sense. They became the hottest item. And you reflect on that little company that I just mentioned in passing that has become the descriptor called Thermos. And you're just like, well, what happened there? Right? How did you guys miss? This was a staple and it became a discretionary. This was something that you just had because you took something to whether it was your coffee or your soup, you took it to work. It was not something you showed off. It was just utilitarian. And yet somehow it's become the thing that it's everyone's favorite swag. It's every tween's favorite item. It's amazing to me how you look at some of these brands that were absolutely purpose-driven product that all of a sudden became something else and they missed the boat. And so whether it's Tupperware or whether it's Thermos, I'm looking at these brands and you're thinking, yes, someone who created something truly special and innovative and utilitarian and it served an incredible purpose, just missed that it could also become something special. And you brought up, again, let's use LV, let's use Nike. Sure. There are wants and there are needs. Wants or needs are big businesses with low pricing power. Wants are smaller businesses with great pricing power. The magic is when you blend the two. The magic is when you can take a need and turn it into a want, because then you can get scale, then you can get replenishment, but you also have pricing power. And so watching, again, these two very specifically utilitarian, who would have thought a coffee mug that keeps things warm would become something special? And yet obviously now it's such a no-brainer. I don't know that Tupperware, that they've become really special, but there's obviously so many more. And they do so many different colors, they do so many different things. And so yes, I think there's something to this notion of just resting on your laurels or believing you have it locked because of legacy. Legacy only gets you so far. And it used to be that legacy plus distribution was all you needed. But that's the thing that DTC changed. The ability for everyone to be there has dramatically. It doesn't mean that the competitors are going to become great businesses, but it definitely made it harder for the existing ones to just continue sitting there and winning simply because they opened up their eyes and said, okay, I own this business.
Yeah, I think just one quick comment on that, not specific to Tupperware, but I do think to a certain degree, this traditional obsession, and I always am careful to put a disclaimer on this, but kind of this obsession in retail with product at the expense sometimes of focusing on the storytelling or on focusing on distribution. You know, when I was at Sears, people would be mostly about, if we just fix the product or we make it more convenient or whatever. But our issue was primarily our distribution, our go-to-market strategy. We weren't where customers were increasingly starting to shop. And also because we were an older brand, we were kind of losing the storytelling authority. But anyway, that's probably a topic for a different episode, maybe number 5 when you come back. But maybe one more, and this is kind of distribution related, maybe not so much the storytelling, but a different flavor of direct-to-consumer has been emerging over the last few years, getting a ton of traction, specifically I don't know what the official name is, direct from factory or whatever, but particularly that model characterized by Temu and Shein. I'm curious what you think of the impact going forward, I guess, that Shein and Temu are going to have on the industry and how some of the companies you follow may need or may not need to respond.
All right, gosh. So big question. Makes a lot of sense. I wonder, and this is above my pay grade, but you think about the de minimis conversation and you wonder, is this all about to change? Like, is it all about to be moved? And I'm sure that's worth a string to pull on. We can go there. But so pretending that the de minimis conversation didn't just materialize, I think that there's no question these businesses have had an impact. But at the same time, other businesses continue to grow. And so like what I keep trying to figure out is, does everyone buying a $4 dress from Shein, is that incremental? Is that instead? Is that, you know what, it's just impulse? Like, there's a lot of different questions. If we believed that every unit bought on Shein came at the expense of another unit not otherwise purchased, then you and I would assume retail would have absolutely collapsed, and that hasn't happened. And so there's presumably some multiplier. But it's interesting because I think whether it was Primark years ago, Shein now, I mean, there's always this new fear of some lower priced, perhaps unfair, whatever we want to think about it, right? Again, going back to like my kids. But there's this question of what is a business that has to spend a certain amount of money that maybe doesn't get certain breaks? How do they compete? And if someone's going to come in, if they're the lower price option, someone comes in at the lower price, do they die? It just hasn't happened yet. And so I think that's really interesting because we have the benefit of speaking about these businesses that are already very large, as opposed to if the three of us had this conversation 10 years ago and said, hey, by the way, Shein is going to be as large as it is 10 years from now. How do you think the rest of retail is going to look? We probably would have assumed some like huge decimation of anyone that sells a dress. And I guess just hasn't really happened, which is good.
Well, Simeon, it's been such a pleasure to hear your voice and glean your insights. Always so fresh, and continue down a great theme. Until we meet again, safe travels, and thanks again for joining us.
Thank you, guys. 40 regular.
Thanks for tuning in. New episodes of Season 9 will be available each and every Tuesday, so be sure and tell your friends and colleagues in the retail industry all about us. If you liked our episode, please take a moment to give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts.
And I'm Steve Dennis, strategic advisor, keynote speaker, and best-selling author of 2 books, Leaders Leap, Transforming Your Company at the Speed of Disruption, and Remarkable Retail, How to Win and Keep Customers in the Age of Disruption. You can learn more about me, my consulting, and keynote speaking at stephenpdennis.com.
And I'm Michael LeBlanc, consumer retail growth consultant and advisor, keynote speaker, and media entrepreneur. You can learn more about me on LinkedIn. Safe travels, everyone.